Victor Hale straightened his cufflinks, turned to face 300 of Chicago's most powerful people, and said it loud enough for the microphone to catch every word. "You're kind, Nia, but no one respects a woman like you. I need someone people actually admire." The chandeliers kept burning. The orchestra stopped. 300 people who had been laughing 60 seconds ago went absolutely silent, not out of sympathy, but out of the particular cruelty of witnessing someone get destroyed in public and not knowing where to look. Nia Brooks stood there in a burgundy gown she'd saved 4 months to buy, her engagement ring still on her finger, and didn't make a single sound. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't give him the scene he probably expected. She simply reached down, placed the ring on the table beside her untouched champagne glass, picked up her coat, and walked out into the freezing November night like she had somewhere better to be. She didn't, but she walked like she did. If that was you, standing in that ballroom, hearing those words in front of everyone you knew, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like Nia's don't come around often, and you do not want to miss a single chapter of what happens next. And while you're watching, drop a comment below. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Nia. The Black Diamond Charity Gala happened every November on the 42nd floor of the Alderton Grand Hotel, and for 3 consecutive years, Nia Brooks had been the invisible woman who made it work. She'd coordinated the seating charts. She'd negotiated with the caterers when the salmon arrived 2 hours late. She'd charmed the difficult donors, smoothed over the scheduling disasters, and spent 6 weeks of unpaid overtime making sure Victor Hale's name appeared on every piece of press coverage associated with the event. Because Victor had told her, early in their relationship, that a man's reputation was his most valuable asset, and that a good woman understood how to protect it. Nia had believed him. For 3 years, she had believed almost everything Victor Hale told her. She believed him when he said her size didn't matter to him, that he loved her exactly as she was. She believed him when he said the reason he never introduced her to his business partners was because he liked keeping his personal life private. She believed him when he said the reason she wasn't in the photographs from his company's anniversary dinner was because the event photographer had simply cropped poorly. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in nonprofit management from Northwestern. She had spent 11 years working in Chicago's charitable sector, quietly building programs that fed families and funded scholarships for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent. She was, by every honest measure, one of the sharpest and most capable people in any room she entered. But Victor had a particular gift, the kind that certain men develop early and refine over decades, for making an intelligent woman doubt her own intelligence. Not through cruelty, through something softer and more corrosive, through the slow, consistent suggestion that her perception of things was slightly off, that she was reading too much into situations, that her sensitivity was the problem, not his behavior. She'd been engaged to him for 8 months. She'd loved him for 3 years before that. The night of the gala, she wore the burgundy gown she'd ordered online and paid for in 3 installments. She'd had her hair done that morning, a woman named Tracy, who worked out of a salon on the South Side, and had known Nia since they were both 22. And Tracy had spent 2 hours on her, and when she was done, she'd stepped back and said quietly, "You look like somebody's everything, baby." Nia had laughed and overtipped her and believed it, at least for a little while. She arrived at the Alderton Grand at 6:15. Victor had asked her to come early to handle the last-minute coordination. He arrived at 7:40 with his business partner, Marcus Webb, and 2 women Nia didn't recognize who worked, apparently, in brand development, a term so vague it covered almost anything. He kissed her cheek when he saw her. A quick, distracted kiss, the kind you gave a wall you were walking past. "Everything running smoothly?" he asked, without quite looking at her. Seating issue with table 9 got resolved. The florist sent the wrong arrangements for the VIP section, but I had them swapped out. You're good. Good. He was already looking past her toward the door, watching for someone more important to arrive. That was the moment. Not the moment later, not the words at the microphone. That was actually the moment Nia should have left. She knew it, somewhere in the part of her that had been whispering warnings for months. But knowing something and being willing to act on it are 2 entirely different things. And Nia had spent 3 years learning to silence that whisper. She stayed. She worked the room the way she always did. She spoke to the right people, laughed at the right moments, steered conversations away from controversy and toward generosity. She was good at this, genuinely good, and she knew it. The director of the Carson Family Foundation told her she was the reason this event actually felt like something worth attending. An alderman's wife pulled her aside to ask if she'd ever considered running for anything, because she had a natural way with people that was getting harder to find in this city. Nia smiled and said she was happy where she was. By 9 o'clock, she'd had 2 glasses of wine and no dinner because she'd been too busy making sure everyone else's plates arrived warm. She found Victor at the bar, deep in conversation with a group of men she recognized as investors from the North Shore crowd. The kind of men who owned buildings and referred to people like Nia's mother as the community, as though community were a polite word for something they'd rather not think about too hard. She touched his arm lightly. He flinched. It was small, almost invisible. But Nia had been watching this man's body for 3 years, and she felt it the way you feel a door lock click shut, that small, unmistakable sound of something closing. "Victor, they're about to start the program. You'll want to be near the stage." He turned to her with a smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Nia, give me a minute." "Of course." She stepped back. "The program director is looking for you when you're ready." She walked away. She told herself it was fine. At 9:30, the program director, a man named Gerald, who Nia had worked with for 4 years and who she genuinely liked, found her near the dessert table and said, in a tone slightly too careful to be casual, "Victor asked me to make a change to the speaking order. He's going to say a few words before the donation announcements. I just wanted you to know." Nia frowned. "That wasn't in the program." "No," Gerald agreed, and then he looked at her with the expression of a man who knows something he wishes he didn't. "He said he had an announcement." She should have known then. Maybe she did know. Maybe that's why her hands went cold. Victor took the stage at 9:52. He thanked the guests. He talked about his company's contributions to the Chicago business community. He made a joke about the salmon that got a laugh from the people near the front who'd heard about the catering situation. And Nia, standing near the back, felt a strange, dreamlike dislocation. The kind you get when you watch someone tell your story as though it belongs to them. Then he said it. He didn't even look in her direction first. He found his business partner Marcus, and Marcus gave him a small nod, and Victor seemed to gather something from that nod, confidence maybe, or permission. And then he said, into the microphone, in a voice carrying a strange, performative sadness, like a man confessing something noble, "I also want to take a moment to address something personal. Some of you know that I've been engaged, and I've had to do a great deal of thinking recently about what kind of future I want, what kind of life, and what kind of partner that life requires." He paused. Nia is a kind woman. She's genuinely kind. But kindness isn't everything. And I think we both know what I need someone who can stand beside me in rooms like this one and command the respect that this work demands. Another pause. "You're kind, Nia. But no one respects a woman like you. I need someone people actually admire. 300 people. 42 floors above the city. The kind of silence that has a weight to it." Nia felt it hit her in the chest first. Not pain exactly, not yet. More like the moment after impact, when the body is still deciding what it's been asked to survive. Her face went very still. She was aware distantly of people turning to look at her, of that ripple of attention that moves through a crowd when everyone suddenly needs to see the same thing. She didn't give them what they were looking for. She reached down and removed the ring from her finger. Not dramatically, not slowly. The way you remove something that doesn't belong to you anymore. She set it on the high-top table beside her, next to a champagne flute she hadn't touched. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She walked toward the exit. Her heels made the only sound in the room for the first 4 steps. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She didn't let her shoulders drop. She walked like she had somewhere better to be. She had no idea that from across the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced Lake Michigan, a man she had never met was watching her leave, and that what he saw in the way she carried herself out of that room would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined that night. His name was Damien Moretti. He was 41 years old. He had dark gray eyes, the color of Chicago winter sky, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something harder and more permanent. Not ugly, but experienced in a way that had pushed past vanity into something else entirely. He wore a black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, though he hadn't bought it for the price. He'd bought it because it fit, and he didn't like things that didn't fit. He'd arrived at the gala as a donor, a significant one, the kind whose check had its own table, figuratively speaking. He came to events like this once or twice a year, not because he enjoyed them, he did not, but because certain kinds of visibility were professionally necessary, and Damien Moretti had learned, early and permanently, the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. He'd been about to leave when Victor Hale took the microphone. He didn't know Victor Hale. He'd heard the name. Chicago's business community was not large, and names circulated, but he had no particular interest in the man. He stayed because Gerald, the program director, had been mid-sentence beside him when the speaking order changed unexpectedly, and Damien had developed, over decades of survival, a precise sensitivity to moments when something unexpected was about to happen. He watched Victor speak. He watched the ripple move through the crowd. And then he watched Nia Brooks cross the room with her coat over her arm and her chin at an angle that struck him, immediately and without any logical explanation, as one of the most quietly devastating things he had ever seen. He'd seen men take beatings in rooms far more brutal than this one. He'd watched people lose everything in ways that would make Victor Hale's little performance look like a spilled drink. He had, at various points in his life, been the reason people lost things they couldn't get back. He was not, by anyone's measure, a sentimental man. But something about the precision of her exit, the deliberateness of it, the absence of theater, stopped him in a way he couldn't immediately explain and didn't try to. He told his security detail he'd be a few minutes. They knew better than to argue. He followed her out. Not immediately. Not obviously. He waited until she'd been gone from the room long enough that following her wouldn't read as following her. He collected his coat from the attendant, declined the offer to have his car brought around, and walked out through the side entrance into the November cold. She was on the street, not waiting for a car, just standing on the sidewalk in her burgundy gown and her wool coat that wasn't quite warm enough for the temperature, her arms wrapped around herself, looking up at the dark sky in a way that had nothing to do with the stars. He almost kept walking. There was no rational reason to stop. He had people to call, decisions pending, a meeting in the morning that would require more of him than most people understood. But he stopped. "That was a cruel thing," he said. She turned her head. Her expression, when she looked at him, wasn't what he expected. Not fragile. Not looking for rescue. More like a woman who had just survived something and was still doing the arithmetic on how she felt about it. "Did I ask for your opinion?" she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." A pause. "Then why are you still talking?" Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, brief and quickly contained. "Honestly, I'm not sure." She looked at him for a moment with the kind of directness most people reserve for conversations they'd had time to prepare for. Then she turned away and said toward the street, "I need a drink. A real one, not whatever they were serving in there." "I know a place," he said. "Quiet. 2 blocks." She turned back, looked at him again, and this time it was a different kind of looking, cautious, measuring, but not afraid. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." Another pause. The wind off the lake moved between them, and Nia pulled her coat tighter and seemed to make a decision based on some private calculation he wasn't privy to. 2 blocks, she said. 2 blocks, he confirmed. They walked. They didn't talk. The street was cold and nearly empty at this hour, and the city made its sounds around them, distant sirens, the low percussion of traffic from the expressway, the particular silence that Chicago carries in November like something it swallowed and can't quite digest. The bar was called Whitmore's, low-lit, old wood, the smell of something that had been cleaned and re-cleaned until it just smelled like itself. 3 other people inside, none of them paying attention to anyone else. They sat at the far end. A bartender who looked like he'd heard every story twice asked what they wanted. "Bourbon," Nia said. "Neat, the kind you don't have to explain." The bartender looked at Damien. "Same," Damien said. They sat with their drinks for almost a full minute before either of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were, for different reasons, used to not filling space with noise. "You don't have to do this," Nia said, finally. Whatever this is. The rescue operation. I'm not rescuing anyone, he said, flat and certain, the way people say things they've thought about before but didn't know they'd thought about until they heard themselves say it. I just didn't want to go back up there. She looked at him sideways. Why? Because everyone in that room is going to spend the next hour talking about what just happened, and none of them are going to say anything real about it. Nia was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her glass, and the bourbon caught the bar light, and she said, half to herself, he practiced it, that little speech. I could tell. The pauses were too clean. Damien said nothing. 3 years, she said, not with self-pity. More the way you say something when you're running the numbers and they're not coming out the way you expected. I spent 3 years making that man look good to people like that. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew which investors he'd accidentally alienated and how to fix it without him knowing I'd fixed it. I wrote half his keynotes. She took a long drink, and what he saw, standing up there, was… She stopped, set down the glass, laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had nothing funny in it. A liability. He's an idiot, Damien said. That's not actually helpful. I know, but it's accurate. She looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since they'd sat down. And he didn't look away, and whatever she found in his face seemed to be different from what she'd expected, because something in her posture shifted, slightly, in a way that was less guarded than before. What's your name? She said. He considered briefly the particular calculation that had kept him alive longer than many people in his line of work. He said, Damien. Nia, she said. I know, he said, without thinking. A beat. Right, she said. It was a public humiliation. My name was involved. Yes, he said, and did not correct himself. She turned back to her glass. Outside, Chicago went on doing what Chicago did in November, surviving itself, grimly and without applause. And in the quiet of Whitmore's bar, a woman who had just had her heart broken in front of 300 people sat beside a man who had broken things of a very different kind, and neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them needed to. This was not the beginning of a rescue. This was not a fairy tale. This was just two people in a bar at the end of a hard night, and the city cold outside, and the bourbon doing what it was supposed to do. But something had started. Neither of them would have called it that, not yet, not that night, but it had. They stayed at Whitmore's until last call, not because either of them planned to. It happened the way certain things happen between strangers, slowly and then all at once, without anyone making a conscious decision to let it. One drink became two. The bartender refilled without being asked. The three other people in the bar left one by one until it was just Nia and Damien and the old wood and the low light and the sound of the city pressing against the windows. They didn't talk about Victor again that night. That surprised her, later, when she thought about it. She'd expected to, had half braced herself for the kind of conversation where a near stranger encouraged her to vent, and she ended up saying more than she meant to and feeling worse for it in the morning. That was the usual shape of nights like this. She'd had a version of it before, after other smaller heartbreaks, and the aftertaste was always the same, embarrassment wrapped in temporary relief. But Damien didn't ask her about Victor, didn't ask what happened, didn't ask how long they'd been together, didn't lean in with that particular expression men sometimes wore when a woman was hurting and they saw an opening. He asked her instead what she'd studied in school. It was such an ordinary question that it knocked her sideways a little. Nonprofit management, she said. Northwestern. Why nonprofit? She looked at him. That's usually where the conversation stops. Most people hear nonprofit and immediately start thinking about how to politely not ask what that pays. I'm not most people. No, she said, studying him for a moment. I'm getting that. She told him about it, the real version, not the elevator pitch she gave at fundraising events. She told him about growing up on the South Side, about her mother who'd worked as a home health aide for 22 years and never once complained about the pay, because she genuinely loved the people she cared for, which Nia had always thought was either sainthood or a coping mechanism, and possibly both. She told him about the summer she was 16 when the community center 2 blocks from their apartment lost its funding and closed, and how the absence of that one building changed the entire texture of her neighborhood within 18 months in ways that were subtle and then suddenly not subtle at all. That's when I understood, she said. It's not about charity. It's about infrastructure. It's about what holds a community's weight when everything else is pulling it apart. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, infrastructure, he said, like he was turning the word over. Most people use softer language. Most people are performing compassion. I'm actually trying to solve something. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite admiration. It was older than admiration, more considered, and said, "What's the thing you most want to solve?" No one had asked her that in a very long time. Victor certainly hadn't. Victor had been mostly interested in how Nia's work made him look. The social capital of having a fiancé who did good things, which was different, she now understood, from actually caring about the good things. She answered Damien honestly, which surprised her. She talked about the gap in services for women coming out of abusive situations who didn't fit the standard intake profile. Too stable for emergency shelter, not stable enough to navigate market-rate housing, falling through every crack in every system simultaneously. She'd been trying to build a pilot program for 3 years. It kept losing funding at the last stage. She kept starting over. "Why does it keep losing funding?" Damien asked. "Because the people who control the money prefer problems they can photograph. Women who are visibly broken. Women who look like what people picture when they think about suffering." She turned her glass slowly on the bar. Women who don't look like they could handle their own situation if someone just gave them the actual resources they needed. Damien said nothing for a moment. "They want dependency. They want a story," she said. "They want to be the answer. They don't want to fund someone else's ability to not need them." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much, gone too far into territory that was too specific and too sharp for a bar conversation with a stranger at midnight. But when he spoke, it wasn't to redirect or soften. He said, "That's one of the most accurate descriptions of how power works that I've ever heard anyone say out loud." She looked at him. "And I've been in rooms," he said simply, "where that subject comes up a lot." She didn't ask what rooms. Something in the way he said it suggested the question wouldn't be fully answered, and Nia had enough intelligence to know the difference between a door that was ajar and a wall someone had painted to look like a door. They parted on the sidewalk at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. He flagged a cab for her, not with the theatrical wave of a man performing chivalry, just a practical gesture, the kind that said he'd done this before. She got in without theatrics of her own. He didn't ask for her number. She didn't offer it. The cab pulled away and she looked out the window and thought, "I will never see that man again." And the thought was neutral, not sad, because she hadn't come with expectations, and so there was nothing to lose. She was wrong, of course, but she had 5 days of being right before she found out. She ran into him at a coffee shop on North Michigan Avenue on a Thursday afternoon that had nothing remarkable about it. She was waiting for an oat milk latte she'd ordered under the name Nina because she was tired of spelling her actual name, a small, tired compromise she'd been making for years. And she was reading something on her phone and not paying attention to anything around her, and then someone said, "They got your name wrong." And she looked up. Damien Moretti was standing 2 feet away with a black coffee and the same expression he'd worn in the bar. Steady, observational, not quite smiling, but not smiling either. She stared at him for a beat too long. "You live in this neighborhood?" "No," he said. "Then why?" "I have a meeting 2 blocks from here." He nodded at the counter. "They called Nina." She turned. The barista was looking around with mild impatience. She collected her drink, turned back, and said, "This is a coincidence." "Yes," he said, with a flatness that made it clear he thought coincidence was an adequate word for the situation and nothing more. They stood there for an awkward 3 seconds that felt longer. "I'm sitting there," she said, mostly because the alternative was saying goodbye and walking away, and she found, somewhat against her will, that she didn't particularly want to do that. She nodded toward a table near the window. "I have 20 minutes," he said. "I didn't invite you to sit down." A pause. "No," he said. "You didn't." He sat down anyway. She should have said something about that. She didn't. 20 minutes became 40. He missed his meeting, or at least he stepped outside at some point and made a call and came back and didn't mention the meeting again, and she didn't ask. They talked about the city, about the way Chicago neighborhoods existed in permanent, uneasy negotiation with each other, about a community garden she'd helped establish in Englewood that had survived 4 winters now, which she considered one of her actual achievements because community gardens almost never survived 4 winters. About a building he owned on the west side that had been vacant for 2 years because the zoning was complicated and nobody in the city was in a rush to uncomplicate it. Could be mixed use, he said. Ground floor services, residential above. What kind of services? That's the part I haven't resolved. She looked at him. Something clicked behind her eyes. Not a plan, not yet, more like the first awareness that a plan might be possible. How many square feet on the ground floor? 4,200 approximately. That's... She stopped. Did math she didn't say out loud. That's enough. For what? She told him about the program again, the one that kept losing funding, more specifically this time. Numbers and logistics, the intake model she'd designed, the partner organization she'd already cultivated, the gap in wraparound services that the program was designed to close. He listened, actually listened, in the way she'd noticed the first night, without looking at his phone, without the slight forward lean of someone waiting for a pause so they could respond, without any of the performance of listening that she'd grown accustomed to from people who were mostly waiting for her to finish so they could say something about themselves. When she was done, he said, "Send me the proposal." She frowned. "I don't have your..." He took a card from his jacket pocket. Matte black. Just a name and an email address. No title. No company name. She looked at the card. "What do you do, Damien?" "Various things," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed pleasantly. "It's not." She took the card. She didn't send the proposal. Not that week. She put the card on her kitchen counter and looked at it every morning when she made coffee and argued with herself about it. Because there was something about Damien Moretti that she couldn't categorize, and Nia Brooks did not do well with things she couldn't categorize. She liked to understand the structures she was operating inside. She liked to know the rules before she played. 3 years with Victor had, if nothing else, sharpened her awareness of what happened when you made assumptions about what you were dealing with and turned out to be wrong. Meanwhile, the rest of her life was doing what lives do after a public humiliation, contracting. 3 colleagues from the charitable sector had texted the morning after the gala to express support. 2 of them, she noticed, had carefully worded their messages to avoid saying anything directly critical of Victor, which told her something about how they calculated professional risk. The third, a woman named Priya, who ran a literacy program on the north side and had known Nia for 6 years, called instead of texting and said, without preamble, "He is a disgusting coward, and I need you to know I told 3 board members exactly that." Nia had laughed, an actual one this time. "Priya, please don't blow up your relationships for me." "Too late. Also, I don't regret it. Are you okay?" "I don't know yet," Nia said, which was more honest than she'd been with herself. "That's okay. Not knowing yet is allowed." Her mother, Claudette Brooks, called the night after that. She'd heard from a cousin who'd heard from someone who knew someone who'd been at the gala. This was the particular speed of information in their extended family network, which had always operated with an efficiency that rivaled any news organization. Claudette was 63 and had strong opinions about most things, and did not soften them for anyone, including her daughter. "I never liked him," she said. "Mama, you said you liked him." "I said he seemed fine. That's not the same as liking him. I was being polite." "For 3 years?" "I was being very polite." Nia sat with that for a moment. "Why didn't you say something?" A pause on the line, the kind that held more than silence. "Because you were happy," Claudette said, more quietly. "Or I thought you were. And I've made enough mistakes in my life to know that telling someone they're wrong about something they love is a good way to lose them before they figure it out themselves." Nia's throat tightened. "You wouldn't have lost me." "You don't know that," her mother said gently. "You don't know what you would have done at 31, newly in love, if I'd started picking holes in the man. None of us know what we would have done." A breath. "How are you sleeping?" "Badly." "That's honest, at least. Come for dinner Sunday. I'm making the rice the way you like it." She went. She sat in her mother's kitchen in the house on Marshfield where she'd grown up, and Claudette moved around the small space with the particular efficiency of a woman who had cooked in undersized kitchens her entire adult life and had made peace with it, and Nia watched her and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for days. She didn't tell her mother about Damien. There was nothing to tell, she reasoned. He was a man she'd had 2 accidental conversations with. That wasn't a story. She sent the proposal on a Wednesday night at 11:47, mostly because she'd spent the whole day telling herself she wasn't going to. She wrote a short note above the attached document. "This is the program I mentioned. I'm sending it because the work deserves to exist, not because I expect anything from it. Take it or leave it." She sent it before she could rewrite it. His response came at 6:13 the following morning. I read it. "The intake model is stronger than anything I've seen in this space. The funding gap on the wraparound services is the real problem. You've identified it correctly, but the current proposal asks for too little. Set it up properly or don't set it up at all. I'd like to talk about the West Side property. Are you available Friday?" Not a question. The last line. Not a question. She noticed that. She told herself it was annoying. She told herself she wasn't going to rearrange her Friday for a man she barely knew. She rearranged her Friday. They met at the building on the West Side, which turned out to be a former manufacturing facility that had been partially converted in the 90s and then left in a kind of architectural limbo. Industrial bones, good light through the high windows, a ground floor that was exactly 4,300 square feet of possibility if you squinted at it right, which Nia did. For almost an hour, she walked the space with a flashlight and her phone's notes app open, talking partly to Damien and partly to herself, working through configurations, imagining intake flows, locating where the privacy barriers would need to go so that clients entering the building didn't feel exposed to the street. Damien walked with her and didn't interrupt. Occasionally, he answered a direct question. Mostly, he watched her work with the same quality of attention she'd noticed before. Serious, specific, not performative. At one point, she stopped in the middle of what had been the main production floor and said, out loud and to nobody, "This could actually work." "Yes," Damien said, "it could." She turned. "What would you want in return?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, and then he said, "A functioning program. That's what I'd want in return." "That's not how real estate works." "I'm aware of how real estate works." "Then why?" "Because," he said, with a patience that had a certain edge to it, not threatening, just particular, the patience of a man who didn't usually explain himself and was choosing to, carefully. "Some things are worth doing that don't require a transaction. And because I think you'd run something here that this neighborhood needs. And because—" He stopped. "Because what?" He looked at the windows. High afternoon light coming through the grime on the glass, turning everything in the space a dull, honest gold. "Because most people with your level of competence are doing it for someone else's benefit. And I find that—" A pause. "Wasteful." She stared at him. He looked back at her, steady and unreadable. "You're very strange," she said. "I've been told." That was October, 2 months after the gala. The program wasn't launched yet. There was paperwork, city permits, partnership agreements, the unglamorous machinery of turning a good idea into an actual thing. But it was moving. For the first time in 3 years, Nia's pilot program was actually moving, and the fact that it was moving because of a man she still barely understood was something she filed away in the part of her mind that handled things she wasn't ready to fully examine. She and Damien had, by then, developed something that didn't have a clean name. They spoke on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. They met in person every week or two. Sometimes about the building, sometimes not about anything specific, which she tried not to think about too carefully, because thinking about it carefully would require her to decide what it was, and she wasn't ready for that. He didn't flirt. That was the strange thing. Most men in his position, whatever his position actually was, which she still hadn't fully pinned down, would have by now introduced some element of pursuit. A suggestion, a lean sentence, something that signaled intention. Damien didn't. He talked to her like she was a peer, like her opinion had weight, like the conversation was the point and not a vehicle toward something else. It made her trust him more, which made her trust herself less. Because trusting men was the specific area where her judgment had recently and publicly failed her. She raised this with Priya one afternoon over lunch. "I met someone," she said, and then immediately, "Don't make a face." "I'm not making a face," Priya said, making a face. "Who?" "I don't fully know what he does." "What does that mean?" "It means he gave me a card with his name and email and no other identifying information, and I've Googled him twice and gotten—" She paused. "Almost nothing. Like, there are mentions. Articles that reference a Damien Moretti in connection with various properties and investments. But nothing specific. No profile. No LinkedIn. No interviews. Priya's face was doing something more complicated now. That's either extremely boring or extremely not boring. I know. And you're still talking to him. We're working together on the program. Nia. What? You're not someone who confuses working with someone for whatever you're describing right now. You know the difference. Nia looked at her plate. He's never said anything, never crossed any line. He's just present. In a way that's... She stopped. I don't know what it is. That's the problem. I don't know what it is, and I keep waiting to figure it out, and instead I just keep having conversations with him and leaving them feeling like I just... She pressed her fingers against the table, like I just exhaled for the first time in months. Priya was quiet for a moment. That sounds like someone who sees you. Don't make it simple. I'm not making it simple. I'm saying sometimes that's the whole thing, someone who actually sees you. It's rarer than it sounds. It was rarer than it sounded. Nia knew this better than she wanted to. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in November. She'd been at the West Side building doing a walkthrough with the architect she'd brought on for the renovation planning, and afterward she'd called Damien to go over some of the structural questions the architect had flagged, and he'd asked her to come to his office. His office was in a building she'd passed 100 times on LaSalle Street without ever particularly noticing. Mid-century, serious limestone face, the kind of building that didn't try to impress anyone because it didn't need to. The lobby had a security desk with 2 men behind it who looked at her with the specific attentiveness of people who were paid to look at everyone exactly that carefully. She gave her name. One of them made a call. She was directed to an elevator that required a key card she was handed in an envelope. 41st floor. The doors opened into a reception area with no receptionist, just a long desk, empty, and beyond it a space that was arranged more like a serious library than an office. Walls of dark shelving, a long table, city views on 2 sides that were frankly extraordinary. Damien was standing at one of the windows when she came in. Not dramatically. He was on the phone, and he glanced over when she entered and nodded and held up one finger. She sat down at the table and opened her folder and waited. His half of the phone conversation consisted mostly of silence punctuated by brief responses. No. A pause. That's not what was agreed. Another pause. Longer. Then explain the discrepancy. A silence that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable even from her end of it, 30 feet away. He has until end of business Thursday. After that, the conversation changes. He ended the call and set the phone down with a controlled precision that suggested the controlled precision was doing a certain amount of work. Sorry, he said. It's fine. She looked up at him. His face was composed, but there was something underneath the composure that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly, more like the state that precedes anger, a readiness that was tightening the lines of him. Everything okay? Yes, he said. A business complication. Walk me through the architect's concerns. She walked him through them. He listened, asked sharp questions, made 2 calls during the meeting to people who appeared to be contractors or project managers, and resolved 2 of the 3 structural questions within 40 minutes in ways that would have taken Nia 3 weeks of navigating city channels to accomplish. That was when she fully registered, for the first time, in her body rather than her head, that Damien Moretti's ability to make things happen was not normal. It was not the ordinary competence of a successful businessman. It was something different in kind, not just degree. The speed, the lack of friction, the way people on the other end of his calls complied without discussion. She didn't say anything about it that day, but on the drive home she thought about it, and then she Googled him again, more carefully this time, and she found something she'd missed in her previous searches. A 3-year-old article in a Chicago investigative publication, dense and carefully worded, about the ownership structures behind a cluster of West and South Side properties. The article never said anything directly. It was the kind of journalism that knew exactly what it was pointing at and constructed each sentence to point without landing. But among the names threaded through the corporate structures, holding companies nested inside holding companies, the particular architecture of insulation, was Moretti Consolidated Holdings. And in a single parenthetical, the article noted that Moretti Consolidated Holdings was understood, within certain Chicago business and law enforcement circles, to be connected to one of the oldest and most discreet organized crime operations in the Midwest. Nia read the sentence 3 times. She closed the browser. She sat in her car in the parking garage under her apartment building for 8 minutes without moving. Then she called him. He picked up on the second ring. "The article," she said. "The one in the Examiner, 3 years ago, about the property holdings on the west and south sides." A beat. "Is it accurate?" A silence on his end that lasted exactly long enough for her to know the answer before he spoke. "Which part?" he said. "Damien." Another silence. Then, "Are you at home?" "I'm in my parking garage." "Go upstairs. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. "You'll call me—" She stopped. "No. Answer me now, right now. Is what that article implied about you true?" The silence this time was different. Not evasive, more like the silence of a person deciding how much truth to give someone they haven't given truth to before, calculating the weight of it, judging whether the person on the other end could hold it. "Most of it," he said. "Yes." The word landed in the car like something physical. She didn't speak. "Nia." "Don't." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I need a minute. Take it." She sat with the word, most, and what it meant, and what she'd been building over 2 months with this man, and the program that was finally moving, and the 4,300 square feet of West Side real estate that was supposed to be the first real foundation she'd ever had for the work that mattered most to her. She sat with the image of Damien at the window on his phone, the controlled precision of his voice, the way people complied without discussion. She sat with the memory of Whitmore's bar and the coffee shop and the building and the long conversations that had felt every time like the truest conversations she'd had in years. She sat with all of it for 60 seconds. Then she said, "I'm not having this conversation on the phone." "No," he agreed. "We shouldn't." "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the coffee shop where we ran into each other." She paused. "And Damien, don't prepare a speech. I'll know." A beat. "I know you will," he said. She ended the call. She sat in the garage for another 3 minutes, and the concrete around her was gray and cold and indifferent the way parking garages always were. And she thought, here's the moment. Here is the fork in the road. Here is the place where a sensible person with a recently broken heart and a reasonable amount of self-preservation instinct would say enough, would close the folder, would thank whatever kept her from going further down a road that led somewhere she had no business. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in her bed and watched the ceiling change color as the hours moved. The particular blue-black of 2 in the morning becoming the gray of 4, becoming the flat, non-committal light of 6 that Chicago produced in November, like it was the only color left in the palette. She'd set her alarm for 7, but she was up by 6:15, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of her nervous system. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen counter and drank it too fast and burned the roof of her mouth, and didn't particularly care. On the counter, next to the coffee maker, Damien's matte black card sat where she'd left it 2 months ago. She'd never moved it. She told herself it was because she kept meaning to put it somewhere more organized and kept forgetting. That was a lie she'd been comfortable with until approximately 9:47 the previous evening. She got to the coffee shop at 7:43. 17 minutes early, which was not like her. She was usually precisely on time, had been her whole life, her mother's influence, the understanding that other people's time had value, and she registered the 17 minutes as information about herself that she filed away without comment. He was already there. He was sitting at the same table by the window where they'd sat the second time, with a black coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that was very controlled and very tired, and she understood from that tiredness that he hadn't slept either, which she did not allow herself to find humanizing in any way that would interfere with what she needed to say. She sat down across from him without taking off her coat. The barista came over. Nia ordered without looking at the menu. The barista left. Nia put her hands flat on the table and looked at Damien Moretti directly and said, "Tell me what I'm actually dealing with." He looked at her for a moment. He didn't look away, and he didn't hedge, and he didn't start with a preamble that was designed to soften the landing. He said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything that's relevant to the fact that I've been working with you for 2 months and you never told me." "I didn't tell you because it wasn't relevant to the work. That's a decision you made for me." A pause. "Yes," he said. "It was." "Don't do that," she said. "Don't agree with me as a strategy. I know what that looks like." Something moved in his face, not quite respect, something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged she'd caught the move before he'd finished making it. All right, he said, what do you want to know? Are you actually in organized crime? Yes. The directness of it, no buffer, no lawyerly redirection, hit her differently than she expected. She'd been braced for evasion. The absence of it was its own kind of impact. How long? She said. My whole adult life. I came up through my father's operation. I've run it myself for 14 years. Run it, she said. What does that mean, specifically? He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. It means I oversee a network of businesses and interests that operate across Chicago and several surrounding states. Some of those businesses are legitimate: real estate, logistics, 2 hospitality groups. Some of them are, he paused, the first pause that felt like choosing rather than calculating. Not legitimate, in ways I'm not going to detail in a coffee shop. Are people hurt because of what you do? The pause this time was longer. Yes, he said. Sometimes. She felt the word land somewhere low in her chest. She kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. She'd had practice, years of it, in rooms where showing what she felt would have cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. And the building, she said, the program, my work, is yours, he said, with a flatness that carried conviction. Completely. I have no interest in using your program for anything. The building is in a holding company that has no connection to anything that would compromise your funding applications or your reputation. I structured it that way deliberately. You structured it that way deliberately, she said slowly. Which means you thought about the problem. Which means you knew there was a problem. Which means you should have told me 2 months ago. He didn't argue with that. Yes. Why didn't you? He looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd done from the beginning. The way that had distinguished him from almost every other person she'd talked to in years. Because I wanted you to know me before you knew what I was. And I was aware, when I made that choice, that it was selfish. The coffee shop was filling up around them. The morning crowd beginning, people with laptops and bags, and the particular absorbed urgency of people who had somewhere to be and were fueling up before they got there. The normalcy of it felt almost aggressive against the specific conversation at this table. Nia said, "What did you think would happen when I found out?" "I thought you'd leave," he said simply. "And I was right to think that. You should." She stared at him. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "What I want isn't the relevant question. Answer it anyway." A long pause. Outside, a delivery truck ground its gears at the intersection, the sound of the city being its ordinary grinding self. "No," he said, "it's not what I want. But what I want doesn't change what I am, and what I am is—" He stopped, started again. "It is not a safe thing to be close to, not for someone like you." "Someone like me," she said, and the edge in her voice was sharp enough that the woman at the next table glanced over briefly and then back at her screen. "Someone who does real good," he said, "in the actual sense. Someone whose work and reputation need to stay clean to function. I am not clean, Nia. I have never been clean. And I can structure legal entities to protect the program's funding chain, but I cannot protect you from knowing what you now know, and I cannot protect you from what it costs to stay close to someone in my position." She sat back in her chair, looked at the window. Outside, Michigan Avenue was doing its morning thing. Cabs and buses, and people bent against the cold, all of it moving with the indifferent momentum of a city that didn't care what happened inside this coffee shop or any other coffee shop. "I need to think," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "Don't—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against the table. "Don't be reasonable right now. It makes it harder." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, brief and quickly contained, but she'd caught it. The particular expression of a person who has armored themselves for a long time against wanting things they can't safely have and has just been reminded of exactly what they're armoring against. He picked up his coffee, drank it this time, set it down. "All right," he said. She left without finishing her drink. She walked 14 blocks instead of taking a cab, because she needed the cold and the movement and the physical fact of the city around her, and she needed to think without anyone's eyes on her. By the time she got back to her apartment, her face was numb and her hands were stiff inside her gloves. and she still didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew something that she hadn't known when she left. That Damien Moretti was the first person in a very long time who had looked at her and told her the truth about himself when the truth was damaging. Victor had never done that. Victor had curated. Victor had managed. Damien had sat across a coffee shop table and said yes and yes and yes to every hard question she asked, without flinching, without redirecting, and then had told her she should leave as though her safety mattered more to him than his own interest. She didn't know what to do with that. She had 3 days where she didn't call him, and he didn't call her. And the silence between them had a texture to it. Not comfortable, not hostile, just present, like whether you're waiting to see what it decides to do. On the 4th day, her phone rang at 6:40 in the morning, and the number on the screen was her mother's. And Claudette Brooks, who never called before 8 unless something was wrong, said, in a voice that was controlled in the specific way of people who are controlling, because the alternative is not controlling, "Baby, I need you to come to St. Matthew's." What happened? They're saying it was a neurological episode. I'm in the emergency room. I'm fine, I think, but they want to keep me for tests and I don't. A pause. A breath. I don't want to be here alone. In a cab in 4 minutes. What followed was the particular grinding horror of hospital emergency rooms at 7 in the morning. The fluorescent light, the insufficient chairs, the information that came in pieces and contradicted itself and then got revised again. The doctors who spoke in careful language that was designed to not say anything definitive because they didn't yet know anything definitive. Claudette had experienced sudden onset neurological symptoms at home. Weakness on her left side, difficulty with word retrieval, a headache that was, by her own description, unlike anything she'd had before. The ER team ran tests, CT scan, blood panels. A neurologist was called and arrived 2 hours later, a compact woman named Dr. Finch, who had the manner of someone who had delivered bad news so many times she'd developed a specific set of muscles for it. The preliminary picture, Dr. Finch said, suggested early-stage degeneration of a kind that was progressive and currently without a standard curative protocol. She used clinical language that Nia, who had a master's degree and had spent years navigating complex systemic issues, still had to have repeated twice before it arranged itself into meaning. She asked 3 questions. Dr. Finch answered them with the careful precision of someone who respected the questions. The answers were not good. Nia sat beside her mother's bed in the room they'd moved her to by early afternoon, and Claudette was asleep, sedated lightly, the nurse said, to manage the headache. And Nia looked at her mother's face, the 63-year-old face that had been the primary landscape of her entire life, and felt something happen inside her that was not grief exactly. Not yet. More like the moment before grief when the mind is still trying to refuse the information the body has already accepted. She sat there for a long time. At some point, she took out her phone. She looked at it. She thought about Priya, who she should call. She thought about the practical things, insurance, second opinions, the questions she needed to research about the specific condition Dr. Finch had named. She thought about her mother's building, her mother's insurance, her mother's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had a spare key and checked in twice a week. She scrolled to Damien's name. She sat with her thumb over it for almost a full minute. She pressed call. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been near his phone, which meant he'd been waiting, which she didn't have the bandwidth to analyze right now. "My mother is in the hospital," she said. Her voice came out flat, which was a sign that the thing underneath it was the opposite of flat. "They're saying it's neurological, progressive. Dr. Finch at St. Matthew's is her attending physician, and she's telling me there's no standard curative protocol, but there are experimental treatments and trials, and I don't know how to..." She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at her mother's sleeping face. "I don't know where to start." A silence on his end that was not empty. "Which hospital did you say?" he said. "St. Matthew's." "What?" "I know someone on the neurology faculty at Northwestern. Not a favor I've used. I'm going to call him now. Don't agree to anything. Don't sign anything until I call you back." "Damien, I didn't call you so you could..." "I know why you called," he said quietly. "Stay with her. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. He called back in 17. He had reached, in 17 minutes, the head of Northwestern's Neurological Research Department, a man named Dr. Okafor, who had published extensively on the specific condition Dr. Finch had named and who had agreed to review Claudette's case files and come to St. Matthew's the following morning for a consultation. He had also, in those 17 minutes, identified 2 active clinical trials that might be relevant, one in Chicago and one at Johns Hopkins, and had gotten the name of the patient coordinator for both. How? Nia said. It doesn't matter how. It does matter. It matters because I need to understand what I'm... Nia. His voice was steady and very direct. None of those calls required anything that will create a problem for your mother or for you. Dr. Okafor is a legitimate physician who owes me a conversation, nothing more. The trial information is publicly available. I just found it faster. A pause. Is she awake? No, she's sleeping. Then go get something to eat. You haven't eaten. How do you know that? Because it's 3 in the afternoon and you've been in a hospital since 7 in the morning, and you're the kind of person who forgets to eat when something is wrong. She stood up, walked to the window of her mother's room, which faced an interior courtyard that had a single tree in it, stripped bare in November, and she looked at that tree for a moment because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't her mother's face. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. Not unkindly. More like a man who was uncomfortable receiving something he didn't feel he'd earned. You did something. I'm acknowledging it. A pause. Eat something, he said. Call me if anything changes. She did eat something. A sandwich from the hospital cafeteria that tasted like the concept of food without any of the content. And she came back to her mother's room and sat back down in the chair beside the bed. And outside the window, the single bare tree stood in the November courtyard doing what trees did, enduring. She had not resolved the question of Damien Moretti. She recognized that she had called him anyway. She recognized that when he'd said, "Stay with her, I'll call you back." She had stayed, and she had trusted that he would call back. And he had. She recognized that this was information about something. She wasn't ready to name the something yet. She was still sitting with her mother 3 days later when Victor Hale walked into the room. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of his footstep, the one she'd spent 3 years learning without meaning to, the slight heel-heavy stride of a man who moved through spaces expecting them to accommodate him. She looked up from the notes she'd been making, and there he was, standing in the doorway of her mother's hospital room in a gray coat that had been expensive enough to be subtle about it, holding a small arrangement of flowers that looked like he'd chosen them from a hospital gift shop in the last 10 minutes, which he had. Claudette was awake. She looked at Victor with an expression that contained several things simultaneously and let none of them out. "Victor," Nia said. Her voice was completely level. She was proud of that, privately. "How did you know she was here?" "I still know some of the same people you do," he said. Not defensive, matter of fact, like this was a reasonable answer. "I heard. I wanted to come." He looked at Claudette. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm sorry you're going through this," Claudette said with the precise civility of a woman who had raised her child to have better manners than she currently felt like demonstrating. "Thank you for coming, Victor." He came in. He set the flowers on the windowsill. He looked at Nia with an expression she recognized from the architecture of their 3 years together. The particular look that preceded an approach, that signaled he was about to ask for something by performing concern for something else. "Can we talk?" he said. "Just for a few minutes." She glanced at her mother. Claudette closed her eyes, which was either permission or a refusal to be present for what was about to happen, and knowing Claudette, it was probably both. Nia stepped out into the hallway. She crossed her arms, not defensively. She just didn't know what else to do with her hands in this particular moment, and she wasn't going to stand in front of Victor Hale with her hands at her sides like she was waiting to receive something. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "What I did at the gala was..." He stopped, seemed to be choosing words with some care. "It was beneath me. I was dealing with a lot of pressure that night, and I handled it badly, and I said things publicly that should never have been said, and I'm sorry." She stood with that for a moment. Victor Hale apologizing was not a thing that happened often, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew she knew it, and she suspected the apology was carrying weight it had been designed to carry. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay? You apologized. I heard you. Okay. I was hoping we could..." He paused. "Nia." We had something real. 3 years. You know we did. And I made a serious mistake and I'm acknowledging it. And I think if we… Victor. She said his name with a quietness that stopped him mid-sentence. My mother is in that room with a progressive neurological condition that is going to require significant ongoing medical management. I have spent the last 72 hours learning more about neurological degeneration than I ever wanted to know. I don't have the space right now. I don't have the room in my head or my heart for this conversation. I'm not trying to… You're trying to reopen a door, she said. I can see it. You've always been readable to me, even when you didn't know you were. That was one of the things about us that only I ever understood. She said it without cruelty, which cost her something. The door is closed. I don't say that with anger. I say it because it's true, and because you deserve a true answer, even if you didn't always give me one. He stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not the wounded vanity she'd expected, something more honest than that, which surprised her. Maybe he'd gotten to a place of genuine reckoning. Maybe the thing at the gala had cost him something too, in ways she didn't know about. Is there anything I can do? He said. For your mother, practically. No, she said. But thank you for asking. He nodded once, looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't fully interpret and didn't try to. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, and she watched him go and felt nothing, she realized. Not anger, not longing, not the residue of 3 years pressing against the moment. Neutral recognition of a chapter that had ended. She went back into her mother's room. Claudette's eyes were open. He looked terrible, Claudette said. Don't. I'm not gloating, I'm observing. A pause. How are you? I'm fine. Nia. She sat back down, pressed her hands together in her lap. I'm fine about Victor. I'm not fine about other things. Claudette looked at her daughter with the particular attention of a mother who has been watching someone she loves navigate the world for 34 years and has developed, through observation, an almost clinical ability to read them. The man who arranged Dr. Okafor, she said. Nia went still. Dr. Okafor mentioned when he introduced himself that he was here as a favor to someone. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Claudette's voice was careful. Favors like that don't come from ordinary men. Mama, I'm not asking you to explain him. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself about what it means that he's the person you called. Nia looked at the window, the bare tree in the courtyard. It's complicated. Most things worth anything are, Claudette said. Hand me some water, please. Nia handed her the cup. Claudette drank, set it down. Looked at her daughter again with that same steady attention. Be careful, Claudette said, but don't be so careful that you miss the thing that's actually in front of you. The thing that was actually in front of her came into sharper and more alarming focus 4 days later. Nia was at her apartment, late, working through the documentation she'd been building for the second opinion process for her mother's treatment plan, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. Ms. Brooks, a woman's voice, clipped, professional, not unkind. My name is Agent Sandra Reyes. I'm with the FBI's Organized Crime Division. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience about your association with Damien Moretti. The room didn't move. The room was exactly where it had been a second ago. But Nia's body registered the sentence the way a building registers something structural shifting. Not collapse. Not yet. But the preliminary sensation of load-bearing things under new pressure. I'd need to speak with an attorney before any such conversation, Nia said. The words came from the professional part of her, the part that had navigated enough complicated institutional situations to know the first rule. Of course, Agent Reyes said. That's your right, and I'd encourage it. I want to be direct with you about something, though, before you go. This is a courtesy call. You're not under investigation. But there are things you may not know about your current situation that I believe you have the right to know, and I'd like to offer you the opportunity to hear them in a setting where you have counsel present. Nia said nothing. The West Side property, Reyes said, the building you've been working with. We've had it under surveillance for 8 months as part of a larger investigation. We have footage of multiple meetings at that location. You appear in approximately 11 hours of that footage, Ms. Brooks. A pause. I want to make sure you understand your exposure, and I want to give you the chance to protect yourself before this goes further. 11 hours of footage. Nia sat down on her kitchen floor. Not dramatically. Her legs just made a decision without consulting the rest of her. And she put her back against the cabinet and pressed the phone against her ear and stared at the ceiling. That was the same ceiling she'd looked at that morning when everything had still been only as complicated as it already was. "I'll have my attorney contact you," she said. "I'll be expecting that call," Reyes said. "Ms. Brooks, I genuinely hope you'll take this seriously. The case we're building has been 2 years in the making. When it moves, it will move fast. The people who are positioned well before it moves—" She let that sentence end without finishing it, which was its own kind of sentence. "Good night." The line went dead. Nia sat on the kitchen floor. Outside, Chicago made its sounds. The city that didn't know or care. The city that was going to do what it was going to do, regardless of what was happening in this apartment. Regardless of what was happening to one woman's life on its kitchen floor at 11:15 on a Tuesday in November. She thought about the program. The 4,300 square feet. The women who didn't fit the intake profile. The 3 years of fighting to make the thing exist. She thought about her mother in the hospital and the treatment plan and Dr. Okafor and the 17 minutes it had taken Damien to reach him. She thought about Whitmore's bar and the matte black card and the coffee shop and the building walkthrough and every conversation in between. She thought about what Damien had said. "I can structure legal entities to protect the program's funding chain." She thought about whether that protection held against 11 hours of FBI surveillance footage. She thought about what it would mean for the program, for her reputation in the nonprofit sector, for every relationship she'd spent 11 years building, if her name appeared in a federal organized crime investigation. She thought about all of it. And then she stopped thinking about all of it, because she realized that thinking about it in the abstract was a way of not doing the thing she already knew she needed to do, which was the hardest thing, which was the thing she had been moving toward from the moment she'd answered Agent Reyes's call. She picked up her phone. She called Damien. He answered on the first ring again. "The FBI called me tonight," she said. "An agent named Sandra Reyes, Organized Crime Division. She says they have 11 hours of footage from the West Side building and that I'm on it." She paused. "Tell me everything, right now. Not the version that protects me from being scared. The actual everything." A silence that was the longest one he'd ever given her. And then Damien Moretti, the most feared man in the Midwest, the man who had said most of it, yes to her most direct question, the man who had structured legal entities and called Dr. Okafor in 17 minutes, and told her she should leave because what I want isn't the relevant question. That man exhaled slowly on the other end of the line and said, "You deserve to know all of it. I should have given you this a long time ago." Another breath. "There's someone inside my organization who has been cooperating with the FBI for 14 months, someone I trusted, and they have been building a case that is not just about me. It's about everyone connected to me. Which means—" He stopped. "Which means you need to tell me," Nia said, her voice gone very quiet and very still. "Whether my mother's treatment, the doctors, the trials, the access you arranged, whether any of that can be used to establish that I have a relationship with you that the FBI could characterize as—" "Yes," he said. One word. The kitchen floor was very cold and very hard and completely indifferent. "Yes," she said back to him. Not a question, not an answer. Just the word itself, sitting between them on the line, carrying everything it had just been asked to carry, which was the weight of a woman's entire life. Arriving at the moment she understood it would never be what it had been before she picked up that first phone call from a number she didn't know. She called an attorney at 7 the next morning. Not the kind of attorney you found on a website. The kind you found through 11 years of working in Chicago's nonprofit sector, through the particular network of people who knew. People who handled situations that required discretion above everything else. His name was Gerald Marsh. Not the same Gerald from the gala, a different Gerald entirely, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing but that her brain, running on 3 hours of broken sleep, kept snagging on anyway. Gerald Marsh had spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before going private, and he had the manner of a man who had seen enough to be unsurprisable, which was exactly what she needed right now. She told him everything in one sitting: the gala, Whitmore's bar, the coffee shop, the building, the program, her mother, Dr. Okafor, the call from Agent Reyes, 11 hours of footage, the informant inside Damien's organization. She told it in the order it happened, without editorializing, without asking him what he thought as she went. Because she'd learned in professional settings that the most useful thing you could do when giving someone information they needed to act on was to give it clean. Gerald Marsh listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a man doing very fast structural calculations. "The footage is the problem," he said. "Not because of what you were doing, which was legitimate nonprofit development work, but because of what they can imply about context. Federal prosecutors don't need proof of participation. They need proof of proximity and a narrative that makes the proximity look knowing." "Does it look knowing?" she said. He looked at her across his desk. "You're an intelligent woman who spent 2 months working closely with a man you subsequently learned was a known organized crime figure. Did you know when you were doing the work?" "No." "Can you prove that?" She thought. The email exchange. I sent him a proposal with a note that said I was sending it because the work deserved to exist, not because I expected anything. That's not the language of someone who knows what she's dealing with. That helps. What else? Every meeting I had at the building, I brought an architect, a licensed contractor. The documentation trail for the renovation planning is entirely above board. I have 40 emails about permit applications. Better. The informant is the variable I can't assess without knowing more about what they've given Reyes. If their cooperation covers the building specifically, he stopped. I need to know who the informant is. I don't know who the informant is. Does Moretti know? She thought about the phone call, the exhale. There's someone inside my organization who has been cooperating with the FBI for 14 months. He knows there is one. I don't know if he knows who. Gerald Marsh put his pen down. Ms. Brooks, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. What is your relationship with Damien Moretti? She held his gaze. We were working together on the program development. Beyond that, we had conversations. Nothing that crossed a professional line. Were you in a personal relationship with him? No. He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluative look of a man whose entire career had been spent deciding whether people were telling the truth. All right, he said. Here's where we are. You're not a target. Ray has called you as a courtesy, which means they want your cooperation, not your prosecution. If the case breaks the way I think it might break, they'll be coming to you formally within the next 2 to 4 weeks, asking you to provide a statement about your interactions with Moretti. You have the right to refuse. You also have the option to cooperate. What does cooperation mean in practical terms? It means a formal interview, recorded, where you tell them what you know about your interactions with him. It means they use your account as part of building the broader case. It means, potentially, that your program, your work, and your reputation stay clean. And it means, he paused. It means giving them something they can use against him. The room was very quiet. And if I don't cooperate? If you don't cooperate, you're not in legal jeopardy from what you've described to me today. But the footage exists. If the case goes to trial and they need to establish the scope of Moretti's legitimate business activities as contrast to the illegitimate ones, you could be called as a witness regardless. And at that point, you're under oath, on record, with no negotiated position. He folded his hands on the desk. The smart move, from a pure self-protection standpoint, is to cooperate voluntarily, control your narrative, and distance yourself clearly and on record from any further contact with him. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which seemed like the wrong response to what she was feeling, which was the sensation of being asked to choose between two versions of herself she hadn't known until this moment were in conflict. I need to think, she said. You have time. Not a lot, but some. She left his office and walked 4 blocks to a bench in Millennium Park that was empty at 9 in the morning and very cold and facing the bean, that enormous mirrored thing that showed you. Chicago reflected back in a curved distortion, every building and sky and person bent into a new shape by the surface. She sat and looked at it for a while and thought about surfaces and what they reflected and whether the distortion was the lie or whether the distortion was, in its own way, more honest than the flat version. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. We need to talk. She stared at it. Then, beneath it, a second text from the same number. Not about Damien, about what you don't know yet. I'm the one who called Reyes. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. She typed back. Who is this? The response came immediately. My name is Carla Voss. I've worked for Damien Moretti for 9 years. I'm the informant. And before you decide anything, there are things he hasn't told you that you need to hear from me. Nia sat on that bench in the cold for 45 seconds. Then she typed, where? They met at a diner in Logan Square that Nia had never been to, which she suspected was the point. Carla Voss was 44, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the particular physical economy of someone who had spent years in environments where visibility was a liability. She was already in a booth at the back when Nia arrived, with coffee she hadn't touched, and eyes that moved to the door the second it opened. She looked at Nia with an assessment that was thorough and quick and not hostile. You're taller than I expected, she said. Nia sat down. Talk. Carla wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I've been inside Damien's operation since I was 35. I started as an accountant. Legitimate. I had a CPA license, still do. I processed the books for the hospitality group, and then over time I started processing other books. You know how that goes. One thing at a time, each one small enough to seem manageable, until you look up and you're 8 years in and there's no version of out that doesn't cost you everything. Why are you telling me this? Nia said. Because I need you to understand that what I did, going to Reyes, wasn't about destroying him. It was about getting out of something I couldn't get out of any other way. She set down her cup. And because what I gave Reyes is not what she implied it was when she called you. Nia went very still. She told you there were 11 hours of footage from the building, Carla said. That's true. She implied that footage establishes your knowing involvement in Moretti's operations. That's not true. You're on film doing exactly what you said you were doing. Program development, renovation planning, legitimate nonprofit work. There is nothing in that footage that implicates you in anything. Then why did she call me? Carla met her eyes. Because she wants you to flip. She doesn't have enough on Damien's core operations from what I gave her. I gave her the real estate structures and some of the logistics network, but the center of what he actually runs, the part that would make the case airtight, I don't have full access to. She thinks you do. I don't. I know you don't. But she thinks that someone who spent 2 months meeting with him privately might have heard things, might know people, might be, she paused, leverage. The word sat on the table between them like something neither of them wanted to pick up. She was using me, Nia said. Not a question, working through it as she said it. She was creating pressure, making you think your exposure was greater than it is, so you'd come in scared and say whatever you knew to make it stop. Why are you telling me this? Nia said again, differently this time, not asking for the stated reason, asking for the real one. Carla looked at her for a moment, then she said, because I've watched Damien Moretti for 9 years, and I have never seen him do what he did with your program. I've seen him negotiate, I've seen him maneuver, I've seen him be generous in ways that were tactical and calculated, because that's how he operates, and he's very good at it. A pause. What he did with you wasn't tactical. And the last thing I want on my conscience, after everything I've already got on it, is you making a decision based on false information about your legal exposure that cost you something that was real. Nia looked at this woman across the diner table and thought, I have no way to verify anything you're telling me. I have no way to know if this is true or if this is Damien's people trying to intercept the FBI's approach. I have no way to know if Carla Voss is what she says she is or something else entirely. She thought all of that. And then she thought about Gerald Marsh's face when she'd told him the details of her email and how the expression had shifted subtly towards something that looked like that's actually useful. And she thought about Agent Reyes's careful phrasing. I want to make sure you understand your exposure. And the particular slipperiness of that phrase, which had implied exposure without defining it, which was what you did when the exposure was not as defined as you wanted your target to believe. If I go back to my attorney and he contacts Reyes and she confirms that the footage doesn't implicate me in any criminal activity, Nia said slowly, what does your situation look like? The same as it did before I called you, Carla said. My cooperation agreement is already in place. My exposure is already defined. Nothing about this conversation changes my position. Then why take the risk of meeting me? Carla picked up her coffee, drank, set it down. Because some things you do because they're right, she said flatly, even when you've spent 9 years doing things that weren't. Nia looked at her for a long time. She left the diner and called Gerald Marsh from the sidewalk, standing in the Logan Square cold with her breath coming out in clouds. and she told him about the meeting with Carla Voss and asked him to contact Agent Reyes and get a specific, on-record characterization of what the footage actually showed. Gerald called back in 2 hours. Reyes was not pleased, he said, but when I pushed for specifics on your exposure, she walked back significantly. The footage shows you engaged in what appears to be legitimate development work. You're not a target, and she confirmed it on record. She still wants a voluntary interview, but the leverage she implied she had is... He paused, and she could hear a particular satisfaction in his voice that lawyers got when they'd caught someone in an overreach, considerably overstated. So she was bluffing. She was creating pressure. It's a tactic, a beat. My advice is still to do a voluntary interview, give a clean account of your work with Moretti, and draw a clear line. It protects you going forward regardless of how the case develops. If I do the interview, she said, does it hurt him? The pause on Gerald's end had a different texture. It establishes that he was using a legitimate nonprofit development project to, potentially, create the appearance of community investment in properties under investigation. Whether that hurts him depends on what the rest of the case looks like. She stood on the sidewalk with that. Give me 24 hours, she said. She drove to St. Matthew's. Her mother was having a better day. The new medication protocol Dr. Okafor had recommended was showing early positive effects, which was not a cure and was not a promise, but was something, and something was what they had right now, and she was holding on to it with both hands. Claudette was sitting up in bed eating something that passed for soup when Nia came in, and she looked at her daughter's face and said immediately, "What happened?" Nia sat down. She told her mother everything, all of it, this time. Not the version she'd been managing, not the edited account designed to prevent Claudette from worrying. The FBI. The footage. Carla Voss. Gerald Marsh. The choice that was sitting in front of her like a locked door she had to pick a way through. Claudette listened. She ate her soup. When Nia was done, she set the spoon down and folded her hands and was quiet for a moment. "Do you have feelings for this man?" she said. "That's not Nia." A silence. "Yes," Nia said. "That's not the point. It's part of the point." Claudette looked at her daughter with the specific clarity that Nia had come to understand over 34 years meant her mother was about to say something she didn't want to hear. "You've spent 3 years making yourself smaller, so Victor could feel bigger. And now you're sitting here trying to decide whether to protect yourself by giving the FBI something they can use against the first man who ever made you feel like your actual size was the right size." She paused. "I'm not telling you what to do. I would never. But I want you to make sure you're making the choice that's actually yours." Nia drove home. She sat in her apartment and did not turn on the lights and looked at the city outside her windows, which was doing its winter thing. The sky pressing low and gray over the buildings, the lake invisible in the dark. Her phone rang. "Damien." She answered. "I know you've been talking to Marsh," he said. Not accusing, stating. "Yes." "And Carla?" She paused. "How do you know about Carla?" "Because she told me she was going to contact you." A beat. "I didn't stop her." The sentence landed with more weight than its words. "You knew she was the informant." "I've known for 3 weeks." "And you didn't—" She stopped. "Why didn't you stop her from talking to me?" "Because she was going to tell you the truth, and you deserve the truth." His voice was very even. The voice of someone who had already gone through the part of this that required going through it. "I need to tell you something. The case is moving faster than Reyes indicated. There are indictments coming. My attorney confirmed it this morning. Within the next 60 days, everything associated with me is going to be under intense scrutiny, and that includes the building and the program." A pause. "I've already had the property transferred to a clean holding company with no connection to me or anyone in my network. The program's funding chain is protected. Your name is protected. Whatever happens to me doesn't touch any of that." She absorbed this. "You transferred the property," she said. "When?" "This morning. Before you called me." "Yes." "So you handled it without asking me?" "Yes." A pause. "Because it needed to be done quickly, and because it was mine to handle." "Damien." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "You keep making decisions that involve me without consulting me. That's the thing. That's the thing I need you to understand is a problem." "I know," he said. And you're doing it again right now. You called to tell me what you've already done, not to ask me what I want. Yes. The word came out with a tiredness that was the most unguarded thing she'd ever heard from him. I know that. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to do this differently. I've operated alone for 14 years, and the way I operate is I see a problem, I solve the problem. I don't, another stop. Asking someone what they want first, when what they want might not be protectable, has never been something He didn't finish. Had to do, she said, because you've never cared enough about someone's answer to make it matter. A silence. Yes, he said very quietly. She stood up, moved to the window. The city out there, indifferent and enormous and ongoing. What happens to you, she said, when the indictments come? That depends on several things I'm not able to control. Are you scared? A long pause, the longest. I haven't been scared of anything in a long time, he said. I don't... He stopped completely. Say it, she said. I'm scared of this, he said, of what I've done to your situation by being in it. I'm not scared of what they're going to do to me. I am scared that when this is over, you'll have had to give up things you shouldn't have had to give up because I didn't tell you who I was when I should have. She stood at the window with that. Outside, a car alarm started somewhere below and ran for 30 seconds and stopped. And the city absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, without comment. I'm doing the interview, she said, with Reyes. Gerald's going to structure it as a clean account of the legitimate work on the program. I'm not giving them anything they can use to build a case against you that they don't already have. But I'm not lying, and I'm not protecting information. Whatever I know, I'll say clearly. That's the right choice, he said immediately. That's exactly what you should do. I know it's the right choice, she said with an edge. I didn't ask your permission. No, he said. You didn't. She pulled on her coat. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she needed to move, needed to be in the city rather than looking at it. Damien. Yes. After the interview, after all of this starts moving, I need you to tell me, truthfully, what the realistic outcome looks like for you, not the version that protects me from worrying, the real one. A silence that went on for long enough that she counted it without meaning to. 8 seconds. And I need you to answer it the way you answered me in the coffee shop, directly, no buffers. Ask. If none of this had happened, no FBI, no case, no indictments, would you have told me? Eventually. Who you were and what you did and what it could cost me to be near you. Would you have told me yourself? The longest silence yet, and then, yes, he said. I would have. I'd been building toward it for weeks. I was afraid of what it would cost me when I did. A pause. It was selfish. I should have done it sooner. She opened her eyes. The city out there. Buildings lit against the winter dark, the lake somewhere beyond invisible. The particular cold that Chicago manufactured in November, like it was the only thing it knew how to make. And down below on the street, people moving in their coats, their breath in clouds, all of them carrying whatever they were carrying, all of them in the middle of their own version of the thing she was in the middle of. None of them knowing about each other. The city holding them all simultaneously without caring about any of them. I'm going to do the interview tomorrow, she said, and then I'm coming to see you. And you're going to sit across from me and tell me everything, the full picture, not the managed version. And I'm going to listen, and then I'm going to decide. Decide what? He said. Whether I'm in this or I'm not, she said, all the way, with everything I know. She paused. But Damien, if I decide I'm in, you will never again make a decision that involves me without asking me first. I don't care what it is. I don't care how fast it needs to happen. You ask. The silence this time was different from all the others. It was the silence of something being considered with complete seriousness, with the full weight of the person considering it. 8 seconds. 10. Yes, he said. I can do that. You can try, she said. We'll see if you can do it. Something that might have been on any other night. Something like a laugh. Brief, rough. Nothing like the managed composure she was used to from him. The most human sound she'd ever heard him make. She ended the call. She stood at the window. Tomorrow, Agent Reyes. Tomorrow, the recorded interview, the clean account, the careful and honest line she would draw between what she knew and what she didn't, between the work that was hers and the world that was his. Tomorrow, the beginning of whatever legal process was going to unfold over the next weeks and months and possibly years. Tomorrow, the real test of whether Gerald Marsh was as good as his reputation, whether the documentation trail held, whether the program survived what was coming. And tomorrow evening, Damien Moretti sitting across from her somewhere, not Whitmore's, not the coffee shop, somewhere new, somewhere that didn't have the weight of any particular moment already attached to it, and the full truth finally between them. She didn't know what happened after that. That was the thing about choosing to stay in something you couldn't fully see the edges of. You didn't know. You made the decision with incomplete information, the way all real decisions were made, and you lived in the uncertainty, and you moved forward anyway because the alternative was standing at the window forever, watching the city, never going down into it. She finished putting on her coat. She picked up her keys. She went downstairs into the cold, and the city took her in the way it took everyone, without ceremony, without promise, without any guarantee of what came next. And she walked, and her breath came out in clouds, and somewhere across the city, in a building she'd never been to, a man she hadn't known 3 months ago was sitting with the phone in his hand after she'd hung up. And for the first time in 14 years, Damien Moretti was not thinking about the next move, or the protected position, or the managed outcome. He was thinking about a woman who had walked out of a ballroom with her chin at an angle that had refused to leave his mind. He was thinking about what it cost to finally be known by someone, so fully, without the armor, without the structure, and to find that they were still there. He sat with that. Outside his window, Chicago was doing what it always did, going on without asking anyone's permission. And somewhere in it, Nia Brooks was walking, and her coat was pulled tight against the November cold. And she was heading toward the hardest morning of her professional life, and possibly the most important evening of her personal one. And she was not running from either. She was walking toward them, both of them, with her chin at exactly that angle. The interview with Agent Reyes lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Nia knew the exact duration because she'd looked at her watch when she sat down and looked at it again when Gerald Marsh put his hand on the table, a small, practiced gesture that meant we're done here. And the numbers had burned themselves into her memory the way certain numbers did when the context around them was significant enough. The federal building on Dearborn was the kind of place designed to make you feel the weight of institutional authority before anyone said a word to you. The lobby, the security check, the elevator, the conference room with its gray carpet and fluorescent lighting, and the recorder placed in the center of the table with the careful neutrality of something that was going to remember everything. All of it was architecture in service of a psychological state, and Nia recognized it for what it was and refused to let it work on her. Agent Reyes was 40-something, precise, with reading glasses she took on and off in a rhythm that Nia quickly understood was not absent-mindedness, but a deliberate tool, a way of marking transitions, of signaling shifts in the register of the conversation. She had a second agent with her, a younger man named Torres, who took notes by hand and said almost nothing. Reyes did all the talking. She started with the gala. She knew about the gala, which meant she'd done her homework on Nia's background before the call, which meant Nia had been on their radar longer than one phone call's worth of time. The knowledge of this produced in Nia a cold clarity rather than panic. She filed the information, adjusted her understanding of the situation's geometry, and answered every question directly. How did you first meet Damien Moretti? At the Black Diamond Charity Gala, November of last year. We spoke briefly outside the venue afterward and went to a nearby bar. Whose suggestion was that? His. But I agreed to it. And what did you discuss? My work in nonprofit development. He asked about what I was trying to build. I told him. Reyes took her glasses off. On. At any point during those initial conversations, did Moretti discuss his business operations with you? No. Did he give you any indication of the nature of his income or his business interests? He described himself as being involved in various businesses, real estate and related interests. He was not specific. And that didn't concern you? Gerald shifted almost imperceptibly beside her. Nia answered without hesitation. People in Chicago's business community are routinely vague about the specifics of their portfolio. I had no reason to read his vagueness as anything other than the standard privacy preference of a successful private businessman. Reyes made a note. When did the conversation about the West Side property begin? He mentioned he had a property with development potential. I mentioned the program I'd been trying to launch for 3 years. The connection seemed mutually useful from a community development standpoint. Mutually useful, Reyes repeated. Can you describe what Moretti received from this arrangement? To my knowledge, he received the use of a vacant property for a purpose that aligned with stated community investment goals. And nothing else. Nothing else that I was aware of. Reyes looked at her over the glasses. It was a look that had been refined over years of sitting in rooms like this one. A look that said, I know there's more, and I'm waiting for you to decide whether to give it to me. Nia met it without blinking, because there wasn't more, not in the way Reyes meant, and she was not going to manufacture implication where there was none. Ms. Brooks, during the period of your collaboration with Moretti, did you ever observe or overhear any communications that suggested his business activities extended beyond legitimate real estate development? The question had the precise shape of a trap, not for Nia herself, but designed to see if she'd volunteer information, reach for helpfulness, fill a silence with more than she was asked. She'd been trained professionally and now legally by Gerald's prep session the evening before to answer exactly what was asked, and nothing more. No, she said. You never heard any conversations? No. Never observed any meetings at the property that seemed unrelated to the renovation project? No. Reyes took her glasses off again, set them on the table, looked at Nia with something that was not quite frustration, more like the recognition of a witness who had prepared correctly and was giving her nothing she hadn't already confirmed in the footage. You're aware, she said, dropping the formal register slightly, that we have significant evidence regarding Moretti's broader operations. I'm aware of what you've told my attorney, Nia said. I can only speak to what I directly experienced. And what you directly experienced was a man who helped facilitate your nonprofit program and arrange specialized medical consultation for your mother. Gerald said, Agent Reyes, I'm not implying a quid pro quo, Reyes said. I'm establishing the nature of the relationship. She looked back at Nia. How would you characterize your personal relationship with Moretti, beyond the professional collaboration? Nia had anticipated this question. She'd sat with it the night before, trying to find the formulation that was both honest and exact, that didn't perform emotion for an audience and didn't deny what was true. I would characterize it, she said, as a significant personal connection that I was in the process of understanding when his legal situation became apparent to me. Were you in a romantic relationship with him? No, not in any formal or physical sense. But there were feelings involved, Gerald said. That's not relevant to... I'll answer, Nia said. She looked at Reyes. Yes, there were feelings involved. I don't believe that's a crime, and I don't believe it changes the characterization of the work I did at the building, which was entirely legitimate. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her glasses, folded them, set them in their case. The click of the case closing had a finality to it. Thank you for coming in voluntarily, Miss Brooks. We may have follow-up questions as the case develops. Your attorney will be our point of contact. She reached over and clicked off the recorder. For what it's worth, Reyes said, in a different voice, not off the record exactly, but differently weighted. The work you were doing at that property is the kind of thing that neighborhood has needed for a long time. I grew up 3 miles from there. I know the gap you were trying to close. Pause. I hope the program survives. What's coming? Nia looked at her. It will, she said. She meant it with the particular certainty of someone who has decided a thing is true and intends to make it so regardless of the obstacles, which was a different kind of certainty from the kind that depended on circumstances cooperating. She and Gerald walked out of the federal building into the December cold, and Gerald said, "You did well," and Nia said, "Thank you." And that was the end of the debrief because there wasn't more to say. She'd gone in clean and she'd come out clean, and the work had been protected. And the cost of that was sitting in a recorded file on a federal server somewhere that now contained 4 hours and 11 minutes of her voice talking about Damien Moretti in the past tense. She drove to see him that evening. He was at an apartment she hadn't been to before, not the LaSalle Street office building, something smaller, a residential address on the north side that felt, when she pulled up, like a place a person actually lived rather than a place a person operated from. The building was unremarkable. The lobby was quiet. She was expected. The doorman sent her up without calling ahead. He opened the door before she knocked. He looked like a man who had been awake for a long time and had stopped fighting that fact. His jacket was off. He was in a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and she could see the physical reality of him. Not the composed, controlled presence of their professional meetings, but the actual person underneath that, who was tired and watchful and carrying something in the set of his shoulders that had more weight than his posture usually admitted to. "How did it go?" he said. "It went," she said. She came inside. The apartment was what she'd have predicted if she'd thought about it. Minimal, functional, nothing decorative except a shelf of books that looked genuinely read and a window that faced north and showed a strip of lake between two buildings, dark and flat in the December night. She sat on the couch. He sat in a chair across from her, which she noticed. The deliberateness of the distance, the refusal to position himself in any way that might feel like pressure. He'd gotten better at this, she thought, in the weeks they'd been doing the complicated thing of knowing each other. Or maybe she'd gotten better at reading him. It was hard to tell which. "Tell me the real picture," she said. "You said 3 possible outcomes. I want to know which one your attorney actually thinks is most likely." He looked at her for a moment. "The negotiated resolution," he said. "There are weaknesses in the case that my attorneys have identified. The informant's cooperation covered the real estate structures and the logistics network, but the documentation of the core operations is complicated for them. Not clean. There are chains of evidence that are challengeable. But the government has significant resources and considerable motivation to make an example of someone at my level, and the informant will testify. That testimony, even if I challenge the credibility, carries weight with a jury. So it might go to trial. It might. And if it goes to trial, then it's uncertain, which is a better position than where I was 60 days ago, when the case looked more complete than it does now. My attorneys have been working." He paused. "There are also other considerations. People who have reason to want this case to resolve quietly rather than publicly. That's all I'll say about that." Nia looked at him. "Are those people dangerous?" "They're people who operate the way I operate. They're not my enemies." "That's not the same as not being dangerous." "No," he said. "It's not." She leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. Outside the window, the strip of lake was invisible now, sky and water the same dark at this hour. "I need to ask you something I've been carrying since Carla Voss told me she contacted you before she came to see me. You knew. You knew she was going to tell me the truth about Reyes's leverage, and you let her." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it would have looked like self-interest," he said. "Me telling you the FBI's case against you was weaker than they implied. You couldn't have known if I was telling you the truth or managing you. You had no reason to trust my account of my own legal situation. But you trusted that I'd believe Carla. I trusted that Carla telling you was cleaner than me telling you. She had nothing to gain by it. You'd be able to see that." Nia sat with this. The logic of it was sound, and that was the problem with Damien, but his logic was usually sound, and sound logic and the right thing were not always the same thing, and she needed him to understand the difference. "You made a calculation," she said, "about how to get me accurate information in the most credible format, which means you were still, even then, managing the situation." "Yes," he said, without flinching. "Did it occur to you to just call me and say, 'The FBI overstated your exposure. Here's what's actually true. I need you to verify this with your attorney, because I understand you have no reason to take my word for it?'" A pause. "No," he said. "It didn't. Because asking you to verify my word would have required me to say I understand you have no reason to take my word for it, and I—" He stopped. The muscles in his jaw moved. "I couldn't say that." "Why?" He looked at her with an expression that was the most unprotected thing she'd seen on his face in 4 months of knowing him. "Because I needed to believe that you had some reason to take my word for it, and saying it out loud would have required me to admit I wasn't sure." The room was very quiet. "Damien," she said, "I did have reason. That's what you haven't—" She stopped, looked at her hands, looked back at him. "You've been operating alone for so long that you can't tell the difference between someone who trusts you and someone you've successfully managed. They feel the same from where you're standing because you've never let it get to trust." He looked at her. "I trusted you," she said, "past the point where it was comfortable, past the point where a reasonable person would have. I called you from the hospital when my mother was sick. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't a calculated assessment of my options. I called you because you were the person I wanted to hear. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" He was very still. "Yes," he said, barely audible. "Then hear me when I say, you don't have to manage me. You can just talk to me. It's allowed." The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences before. Not the silence of someone calculating. The silence of someone arriving somewhere they hadn't expected to arrive and needing a moment to understand that they were there. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "I've been the person who manages situations for so long, I don't—" He stopped. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm asking you to try one thing differently, just that one thing." He held her gaze. "I'll try," he said, in the voice of a man who meant it, and knew that meaning it and doing it were two different mountains. The legal process unfolded over the next 7 months in the way that federal legal processes do, not with the clean narrative arc of what happens in courtrooms on television, but with the grinding, incremental, frequently anticlimactic machinery of motions and countermotions, delays and continuances, negotiations conducted in lawyers' offices that lasted longer than trial preparation and mattered more. Nia watched it from a distance that was not indifference. She had drawn her line carefully, and Gerald Marsh helped her hold it. She was not Damien's legal advisor, not his strategist, not a person enmeshed in the case's outcome in any way that could compromise her. She was someone who existed in his life in a territory that was clearly separate from his legal situation, and she maintained that separation with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake if the lines blurred. The program launched in February. It launched 3 months behind schedule because of the complications around the property transfer and the need to redocument the funding chain in a way that satisfied Gerald's concerns and the concerns of 2 foundation donors who had heard enough to ask careful questions. Nia answered every careful question with the full documentation of the program's legitimate development history. Every meeting, every email, every permit application, every architectural consultation. The paper trail she'd built without knowing she was building it, the professional reflex of someone who had spent 11 years making sure her work could withstand scrutiny, turned out to be exactly the armor that protected it. The first cohort of 12 women moved through intake in February and March. 3 of them had children. 4 of them had pending legal matters that required navigation. 2 of them had no identification documents, which was the crisis Nia had designed the intake model specifically to address. All 12 of them arrived at the West Side building on their first day and were met by Nia and 2 case managers she'd hired, and 1 volunteer who was a retired judge named Patricia Okafor, no relation to the doctor, who came in on Thursdays to help with the legal navigation component. The day the first cohort completed their initial stabilization phase, Nia sat in her office, the small one she'd carved out of what had been a storage room in the back of the building, and looked at the paperwork in front of her and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than both. The specific feeling of a thing that has lived in your head for years, finally having the weight and texture of something real. She called her mother. Claudette was at home. The medication protocol was working, not curing, the neurologist had been careful about that word, but stabilizing in a way that was allowing her to live more fully than the initial prognosis had suggested. She had good days and harder days, and had developed, with characteristic Claudette pragmatism, a detailed system for managing both that involved a whiteboard in her kitchen and a standing appointment with a physical therapist named Jerome, whom she described as relentless but effective. "It's running," Nia said. "The program is actually running." "I know," Claudette said. "You know?" "Priya called me. She said the first cohort is underway and that you looked like yourself for the first time in a year." Nia sat with that. "Priya shouldn't be calling you behind my back. She's known me since you were 22. She calls me when she thinks I'll want to know something. I've asked her not to stop." A pause. "How's Damien?" It was the first time her mother had said his name directly. "Waiting," Nia said. "His attorneys think the negotiated resolution is the most likely outcome now. There are still—" She stopped. "There are still variables." "Are you with him?" The question in its simple form. Claudette asking not what do you plan to do or what does this mean for you, but the present tense question about the state of something she'd watched her daughter navigate for months without naming directly. "Yes," Nia said. in whatever way makes sense right now, which is, she looked at the ceiling of her small office, which is not a clean thing. It's not a tidy thing. It's a thing I do knowing all the ways it's complicated and choosing it anyway. That's what love is, Claudette said, when it's the real kind. Mama, I'm not romanticizing it. I'm defining it. The real kind is always the complicated kind. Anything that's clean and simple is either new or it's not the real thing yet. A pause. Your father and I... She stopped. It was rare for Claudette to start a sentence about Nia's father, who had been gone for 21 years, and rarer still for her to leave it unfinished. He was complicated, she said finally. Not in the same way, but complicated, and I chose it, and I'd choose it again. Nia didn't say anything. Go home, Claudette said. Get some sleep. The program will still be running tomorrow. In April, Damien's attorneys reached an agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. It was not the outcome Nia had hoped for. It was not the worst outcome she'd feared. It was the specific, unsatisfying, compromise-shaped thing that real outcomes were. A negotiated resolution that included a significant financial settlement, the transfer of several properties to federal oversight, and an 18-month period of supervised release with strict conditions. No incarceration, no trial. The case against the core of his operation remained legally complicated enough that the government had concluded a trial was a risk they weren't willing to take when a settlement achieved their principal goals. He called her when it was done. It's over, he said. She was at her mother's house. She'd been there for dinner, the rice made the way she liked, the small kitchen full of the sounds and smells of the home she'd grown up in. And she stepped out onto the back porch to take the call. And it was April, and Chicago was doing the thing it did in April, where it couldn't quite commit to spring, cold, and then almost warm, and then cold again, the lake sending weather inland that couldn't decide what it was. Are you okay? She said. Yes, he said. Are you? Yes. A pause that was different from all the pauses before. Lighter. Not full of calculation or confession or the weight of things unsaid, just space. I'd like to see you, he said. I know, she said. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she said. She told her mother when she came back inside. Claudette was washing dishes, and she looked at Nia over her shoulder with the look that meant she'd heard the tone of the porch conversation without hearing the words. Good, Claudette said. Just that. Then she handed Nia a dish towel and said, dry. They saw each other 2 days later. Not at his apartment, not at the building, not anywhere with context already attached. He'd suggested a restaurant on the far north side that neither of them had been to, and they sat at a corner table and ordered food and ate it and talked the way people talked when the crisis was over, and the ordinary world was presenting itself again, and the ordinary world required a different kind of navigation than the one they'd been doing for months. He looked different. Not dramatically, not younger or older, but settled in some way that hadn't been present before. The supervised release conditions were strict, and he was living within them with the same precision he applied to everything, which was, she thought, probably one of the reasons his attorneys had been able to make the case for the arrangement in the first place. He was not a man who violated agreed terms. Whatever else he kept his word. The building, he said, the ground floor. The program is there permanently. That's not subject to the settlement terms or the property transfers. It was transferred correctly before any of this broke, and Gerald confirmed the chain is clean. I know, she said. Gerald told me months ago. I just wanted to say it, directly. To you. She looked at him across the table. You wanted to say it directly, without managing how I received it. A pause. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm working on it, he said. I know you are. She meant it without irony, which was the thing that had changed, not between them but in her, in the way she held the knowledge of who he was and what he'd done and what it had cost both of them. She was not a woman who forgave easily or forgot selectively. She had a clear accounting of everything, the omissions, the managed information, the decisions made without her, the months of proximity to something that could have destroyed everything she'd spent 11 years building. She held all of it, accurately and without revision. And she held alongside it the 17 minutes and Dr. Okafor, and every long conversation that had felt like exhaling, and the way he'd said, I'm scared of this, and meant it, and said it anyway, and Whitmore's bar on a November night when she'd had no reason to trust anyone, and he'd sat beside her and not tried to rescue her. And that had been, against all logic, the beginning of something that had turned out to be the realest thing she'd experienced in a very long time. Both things were true. The whole complicated, unresolved, imperfect truth of it held without choosing one side of it over the other. That was the real thing, she thought. That was what her mother had been trying to say. The gala happened again in November, 1 full year after the burgundy dress and the untouched champagne and Victor Hale's microphone and the freezing sidewalk and Whitmore's bar. The Black Diamond Charity Gala, 42nd floor of the Alderton Grand Hotel. Same chandeliers, same orchestra, same gathering of Chicago's institutional power dressed in its formal clothes. Nia went. She'd been asked to speak, not as someone's companion, not as the event coordinator working the margins, but as the founding director of what had, by November, become a program that 3 foundation boards were actively competing to fund, and that 2 aldermen had cited in public statements about community development models worth scaling. She didn't look back. She gave her speech at 9:15, 400 words, measured and direct, about what the program had done in 9 months and what it intended to do in the next 3 years, and what it said about the gap between what communities needed and what institutional funding had historically been willing to provide. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't perform passion. She spoke the way she'd learned to speak over 11 years of doing work that mattered in rooms that weren't always sure it did. When she finished, the applause started with a table near the front. The Carson Family Foundation Board, she registered, the woman who'd told her a year ago that she was the reason this event felt worth attending, and moved outward through the room in the way applause did when it was genuine rather than social obligation. She stepped away from the microphone. Gerald was near the back. Priya was near the bar, making a face that meant she was trying not to cry, which was very Priya. 3 foundation representatives she needed to speak with were positioning themselves to intercept her before the evening ended. She stood for a moment at the edge of the stage area and looked at the room, the chandeliers, the same gold light, the same city. 42 floors below. And she thought about the woman who had stood in this room a year ago in a burgundy dress with 4 months of savings on her body and an engagement ring on her finger and a man at a microphone systematically removing the ground from under her. She thought about the sidewalk, the cold, the particular angle of her chin. She thought, I did not know that night that I was already walking toward something. I only knew I was walking away from something that wasn't real. Sometimes that's the whole thing, walking away from what isn't real, even when you can't see what's ahead. Especially then. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. A text. Damien. How did it go? She looked at the message, looked at the room, looked back at the message. She typed, Come see for yourself. There's someone I want you to meet. She meant Priya, who had been asking to meet him for 3 months and whose judgment Nia trusted more than almost anyone's. She meant Gerald Marsh, who knew the legal architecture of everything and whose opinion of Damien would be useful information. She meant, in a broader sense, the life she was building, the program, the work, the relationships, the room she was standing in as herself rather than as a supporting character in someone else's story. She meant, this is what it looks like, all of it, imperfect and ongoing and more real than anything I've known. Come be in it. His response took 40 seconds. On my way. She put the phone back in her clutch. A foundation representative reached her with an extended hand and a warm smile and a specific question about the program's waitlist numbers, which Nia answered clearly and completely, and with the professional attention the question deserved, because the work was always the work, regardless of what else was true. Outside, the city turned below them. Chicago in November, the lake dark beyond the buildings, the streets full of people moving through their ordinary evenings with no awareness of this room or this conversation or this woman standing at the edge of a party that had tried to end her a year ago and had instead, through the particular perversity of real life, turned out to be the beginning of the most significant chapter of it. The chandeliers kept burning. The orchestra kept playing. Nia Brooks stood in the middle of it, not at the margins, not in the kitchen coordinating the caterers, not at the edge of someone else's frame, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had walked through the worst night of her life and come out the other side knowing, finally, the specific and unrevised truth of her own worth. Not because a man had shown her, not because a program had proven it, but because she had gone through the fire of the last year, the humiliation, the uncertainty, the legal exposure, the fear for her mother, the fear for her work, the impossible navigation of loving someone she couldn't fully protect herself from loving. And she had come out the other side still standing, still working, still herself. Still enough. That was the thing Victor Hale had tried to take from her in this room a year ago. That was the thing she had refused to surrender, not loudly, not with a speech or a confrontation or a dramatic scene, just the quiet refusal of a woman who picked up her coat and lifted her chin and walked out into the freezing night and kept going. She had kept going. The elevator opened across the room. Damien Moretti stepped out. He was wearing a dark coat over a dark suit, and he moved through the room the way he always moved, without announcing himself, the crowd parting slightly without quite knowing why. And he found her from across the ballroom the way he always found her, directly and without searching, as though the specific coordinates of wherever she was standing were simply information he had. He crossed the room. He stopped when he reached her, close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be respectful of where she was and what she was doing. "You gave the speech," he said. "I gave the speech. How was it?" "It was what I wanted to say." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to know, the one that was not quite a smile but was warmer than his face usually allowed, the one that happened rarely enough that when it did it meant something specific. "Good," he said. "There are people I want you to meet," she said. "Not tonight necessarily. Tonight is—" She looked at the room. "Tonight is mine. But there are people who are part of what I'm building, and I want them to know you in a context that's real. Is that—" She paused. "I'm asking, because that's what we do now." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're asking me." "I'm asking you." A beat. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." She reached out and touched his arm, briefly. Not a gesture of claim, not performance, just the simple human contact of one person acknowledging another in a room full of people. And then she turned back toward the Foundation representative who had appeared again with a second question, and she answered it, and Damien stood beside her and was quiet while she worked, which was something she'd noticed about him from the beginning. He was good at being present without needing to be central. Later, much later, after the speech and the conversations and the long work of the evening, they stood on the sidewalk outside the Alderton Grand in the November cold. The same sidewalk. The same cold, more or less. The city doing what it always did. She looked up at the building. 42 floors of lit windows. "A year ago," she said. "A year ago," he agreed. She looked at him. "Are you different?" He thought about it with genuine seriousness, which she appreciated. He'd never given her easy answers, and she didn't want him to start now. "I don't know," he said. "I'm trying to be. That might be the most honest answer." "It is," she said. She looked back at the building. At the light coming from 42 floors of windows, and below it the street, and around it the city, and above it the same winter sky she'd looked up at a year ago while not crying, while deciding to walk. "What are you thinking?" he said. She thought about the program and its 12 first women and the second cohort already forming and the whiteboard in her mother's kitchen and Priya's face during the speech and Gerald Marsh's satisfied voice on the phone and the bare tree in the hospital courtyard and the matte black card that had sat on her kitchen counter for 2 months before she'd sent the email. She thought about how none of it had been clean, how none of it had been the story she would have written if she'd been writing it. How the worst night of her life had been the door she'd walked through to get to everything that came after. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I'm glad I didn't cry." Damien was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. She put her hands in her coat pockets. He didn't take her arm and she didn't take his. They stood on the sidewalk together in the November cold, two people who had found each other through the specific and unlikely accident of a broken engagement and a bar with good bourbon and a city that didn't care what happened inside it but contained, in its sprawling, indifferent enormity, every possible thing that could happen to a person, including this. Including exactly this. Then she started walking, and after a step he walked beside her, and the city received them the way it received everyone. Without ceremony, without promise. And they went on into it, and the story, which was not a fairy tale and had never been, and would never be, continued in the only way real stories did, imperfectly, honestly, one ordinary, difficult, extraordinary day at a time.